Have any of you ever seen someone get off of an airplane, drop to their knees, and kiss the ground? Now, you've heard about that, but if you've never seen it, then you should have been flying with me yesterday. Because we've got this exceptional heat that everybody's been talking about. And you think it's hot down here on the ground. Imagine what it does up in the atmosphere, the turbulence it creates. Now, I knew it was going to be bad as we're flying into Greenville. We're still about 15 minutes out. And we get the notice, buckle up as quickly as you can and get ready. And this was as bad as I've seen in a long time. Those huge drops and then the back up and down and then speeding up and slowing down. And I knew we had a new flight attendant because she's reading all of her lines. I wondered about the pilot and how experienced he was as well. And we circled Greenville a couple of times. I didn't know if he was looking for a good opening or working up his nerve. I couldn't figure out what was going on up there. But we came down hard and fast, and we hit hard, and it's one of those occasions I thought was designed for you kiss the ground. And you say you'll never fly again, at least not till the next time, of course. A rough day. You know, there's a lot of things in life that can be really rough and tough, a bad thing. I'm going to talk about a bad situation today because I'm talking about the family of Abraham. That's where our sermon series is going. We're looking at the individual members of his family and looking at their story, good or bad, to see what lessons we can learn from the family members. Everybody knows Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, but they are surrounded by other members of their family who also have names and stories, and those stories can teach us something. Last week was Sarah, the wife, the matriarch. This week is Hagar, the handmaid. I call her the handmaid who had to go. Now, let me tell you, with Hagar, that is a strange tale. Her story is an odd story. So let me remind you how her story played out. First, Hagar was an Egyptian servant. She's a slave that Abraham and Sarah picked up when they were traveling through Egypt. And she's a handmaid. And by handmaid, that means of the many servants that Abraham had, this one was assigned to work personally with Sarah. She'd be there in the quarters, helping her to dress and do whatever else Sarah needed. She would be so close to Sarah, they would have conversation. And she would also be there hearing when Sarah is talking business with someone else. Very close relationship. That was Hagar. Now, Sarah, unable to have kids, always had been throughout her adult life, unable to have children, yet longing for children. And at some point, a plan was devised. The plan was that Abraham would have sex with this woman, and then she'd become pregnant, produce a child, and the child would then belong to Abraham and Sarah as their child, raised as their heir. It's not going to be some romantic liaison or anything like that. No, just simply a job to be done by this servant to produce a child. At least that was the plan. Now, if you're wondering who cooked up that scheme, it was Sarah. Sarah is so desperate to have a child that this was her idea. And so in Genesis chapter 16, in verse 2, she speaks to her husband, Abraham. And she says to Abraham, the Lord has kept me from having children. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to sleep with this lady, my young handmaid, and then it's through her that I'll be able to raise up a family. At least that was the plan. Now, this plan really didn't go as well as anybody expected. And so it was that the next thing that's going to happen in the story of Hagar is she's going to take off and run. She'll become pregnant, but once she becomes pregnant, it says that she treated her mistress, Sarah, with derision. Now, we're looking at the English translations of a Hebrew term, trying to make sense of that Hebrew term. She derided Sarah. That could mean, for example, that once she became pregnant and Sarah could not, she may have felt a little sense of superiority, what I can do that you can't, how he'll appreciate me because I'm doing what you couldn't, so perhaps that. It could be, though, that she's got some personal feelings about what was done to her. After all, she's a servant being used to get something done. That's a little bit demeaning. It's not treating her like a person, like a human being, but rather treating her as something to get what I want. And she may have a reaction to how she was treated in this whole operation. Whatever the case, she approached her mistress with derision. Now, at some point, the tension between the two ladies got so great that Sarah's going to speak to her husband in Genesis 16, verse 6. And she'll say to her husband, you need to do something about her. And he says, it's your servant, it's your handmaid. You do whatever you think is the best thing to do with her, and I'll support you on that. So what did she do? She mistreated the handmaid. Those two went at each other. At some point, she packed her bags, and Hagar was gone. She took off to the wilderness, because that's where they live. They're nomads in the wilderness, and she's off all by herself. But an angel of the Lord appeared and told her, go back home. You go back home, you deliver that child, you stay in that household, and God says he'll take care of you and the child. You got to trust in the Lord. You trust him, he'll take care of you. She went back home. The child was born, they named him Ishmael. Ishmael grows up, and for several years, this family has a child in the household. Now, it's supposed to be Abraham and Sarah's. It's Hagar's. The child is definitely attached to his mother. She's attached to him. There comes a point, though, about a dozen years later. About a dozen years later, she's going to be sent away this time, and she'll be sent away because, well, Sarah got pregnant. And she gave birth to a son they named Isaac. She was filled with joy and laughter after that. And once she had her son, she had no use for this other kid or his mother. So she approached Abraham in Genesis 21. And she told him, you get rid of the woman servant. Get rid of her. Because that boy of hers will have no place, no part of the inheritance of my son Isaac. Poor old Abraham, he's got to deal with a wife who's unhappy, but a situation which is no fault of Hagar, and a boy that he's raised as his own son. He is his son. What's he to do? God says, go ahead and do what needs to be done. And so he packed her up with some food and water and sent Hagar and Ishmael off into the wilderness to take care of themselves. At some point, they'll run out of water. At some point, she is prepared to die. It says that she took her son Ishmael and put him under what little shade she could find, and then she moved a distance away because she didn't want to watch him die. And then she prepared for death. Angel of the Lord appeared. Angel said, God promised you that if you would trust him, he'll take care of you. Even now, he'll take care of you. And a spring of water came up from the ground. Miraculous. And she had water. And then from that day forward, she will live in the wilderness, she and Ishmael, and God will take good care of them. He'll provide for them all the way to the very last day. Now, that's the story of Hagar, a rather strange tale if you think about it. Now, let me step outside the Bible and get into history, because I want you to know that's not all we know about Hagar, because after the Bible story, people were still talking about this lady. First, let me talk about religious art. If you look at the famous painters of history, or even some of the not so famous, they all loved to paint pictures of the story of Hagar. Hagar's story fascinated them, and so there are dozens and dozens and dozens of paintings that tell the story of Hagar. So, for example, the story of Sarah taking Hagar and presenting her to Abraham, dozens of paintings. I picked two that are PG rated because most of the artists like to draw Hagar not clothed, as Sarah is presenting her. I didn't want to present that to you today, so I got you two that I could. But they love that scene of her presenting the slave to Abraham. There's also painting after painting of being kicked out of the house. You two leave. Now, you look at those paintings closely and you'll realize religious art is good because it tells the Bible stories, but it's also weak in that it often gets the details wrong. And in the case of these paintings, you'll see the little small boy. Ishmael's about 13. He's a teenage boy. You'll see the wrong dress style, the wrong skin coloring oftentimes. You'll see, for example, Abraham kicking her out of the house. He lived in a tent all of his life. There's a lot of details that just aren't quite there. I got another painting for you. You look at this one. They can't even get the right century. I mean, this is a more modern, the artist time period, and here he is kicking her out. And, well, you get the idea. They're telling the story if they don't get the details right. They love to paint pictures of the suffering in the wilderness. Oh, they're ready to die, and they're just laying there languishing, lots of portraits of that. And then pictures of the angel appearing and the angel having the conversation. God will take care of you, and the angel's portrayed in different ways. And pictures of the pool of water, the spring that came up from the ground by God's power. Artists love to paint the story of Hagar because it's a strange tale. Now, we'll tell you this. You put those two women side by side, Hagar and Sarah. Sarah may be the woman of faith, the wife of Abraham, and all those things, the one that's praised in the book of Hebrews, but artists like Hagar more than they like Sarah. It's hard to find a good painting of Sarah, but there are dozens and dozens of paintings of Hagar. Artists enjoy telling her story in paint. Now, it's not just artists who are attracted to the story of Hagar, but she also has a place in history with a lot of different people groups. She's become a symbol. Hagar is a symbol of something for various people. So let me give you some examples of that. For example, among Arabs. Among Arabs, Hagar is a symbol that they like to use all through their history. Now, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. The Jews came from Abraham and Sarah through Isaac and Jacob and all the way down. But the Arabs come from Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael. And so when they look back to their forefathers and their foremother, they go back to Hagar. Hagar is highly regarded among Arabs. Not only that, but the name Hagar is a very popular girl's name among Arab-speaking people. Fact is, if you go to the land around Israel, in the disputed territories, like the West Banks and the Golan Heights and whatever, where they dispute who should really own this property. Should it be the Jews or the Palestinians? A very popular name to name a daughter is to name her Hagar, because that's a political symbol. It's a symbol that says, I support Palestinian rights and Palestinian cause against what the Jews have done to the Palestinians. And so the name Hagar has become a very symbolic name among Arabs. In Islam, she carries symbolism. Among Muslims, they revere her. Now that makes sense if you think about it, because your first Muslims were Arabs. They're in Saudi Arabia, where Muhammad gets his start. So they're coming from that stock of Hagar, but it's more than that. Because when they go to Mecca once a year for the big pilgrimage, hundreds of thousands of people assembled there at Mecca. As they go there, they've got a week of traditions where they do rituals, little daily rituals. You do it as a family. And the rituals will symbolize the wanderings of Abraham, the nomad, Abraham and his family. On one of those days, the ritual is that you have to run from point A to point B and run back and forth 2 or 3 times. You're going through the motions of Hagar. She's running around looking for water. So you're symbolizing Hagar's search for water. Also, nearby at Mecca, there is a spring of water. They call it the Zam Zam Well. And this is traditionally the site, they say, is where God brought the spring of water. And thus Muslims come, and they come to get a drink from the water as they're going to Mecca. It's a favorite place for them. Also, they take away bottles of water and take it home with them. A holy water, they consider it, just like the Roman Catholic Church has its holy water, the Muslims have there. Now, I'm going to recommend, don't you drink it. You're thinking, I wasn't going, I'm not a Muslim. I know. But even if somebody gave you a bottle, I wouldn't drink it anyway. Saudi Arabia puts a warning that says that this is not safe drinking. It's got high levels of arsenic in it. I don't think the Muslims care because they're getting that small sample in this holy water. But this is something they do to commemorate Hagar and the miraculous water that came. Also, the Baha'i religion, they honor Hagar. Now, you may not know about Baha'i and who they are and what they believe. Some Sunday evening, I'm going to teach about them, so you will. But I will tell you, it's a mix of various things put together in one. And if you go back to the early days, to their early leader, the Bab, he spelled it B-A-B, called himself the Bab. The Bab told his genealogy, his family tree, and as he works backwards, he goes back to Hagar and Abraham as his credentials. You see, a number of religions go back and look to Hagar, not to Sarah. Also in modern times, in our day and age, our lifetime, Hagar has become a contemporary symbol for some causes, issues of our day. And so what you'll find is sometimes you'll see a picture of Hagar and it'll be some young, attractive woman with a baby, or a statue of Hagar, and she's looking pretty saintly because she's a modern day icon and symbol. For example, with surrogate pregnancy. So if someone goes to a fertility clinic, in vitro fertilization, and you have a woman who's going to have the egg and the sperm and carry the baby, and then the baby belongs to this couple, a surrogate pregnancy, Hagar has become the symbol that says this is okay to do because, after all, it's in the Bible. Hagar did it with Abraham and Sarah. Now, by the same token, there are people who use the Hagar story and argue against surrogate pregnancy. They say, see what a mess that thing turned out to be? So, yes or no. And both sides use Hagar as their symbol. Also, among feminists and the women causes, Hagar shows up time and time again. And that's everything from the left-wing radicals that you and I would have nothing to do with, or even more to the right, real legitimate causes for women. Still, they're always looking for symbols, icons, this lady, that lady, someone who underwent a lot of suffering and oppression and yet remained strong and overcame it. They look for women like that as symbols, and Hagar is used as a modern-day symbol because she had to deal with a powerful woman who did her wrong and a man who would not reach in and help and defend her in her time of need. And the wilderness where she was struggling to live, and yet she did survive. And so she's become a symbol for strong women. You see, Hagar is very popular, much so more than Sarah has been, because history's looked back and seen something there that they find that they appreciate. Even the Apostle Paul went back to Hagar in the book of Galatians. In Galatians chapter 4, Paul's talking about law versus grace, about trying to work and try to be good enough versus trusting in God and His grace through Jesus Christ. And so he'll use the two women. He'll use Hagar and Sarah and say they are symbols, they're allegory. And Hagar represents the old covenant of Moses, which served its purpose, but now we've got the new covenant, Sarah. The new covenant, which is grace and promise and hope. And then he does that so he can finally quote that one verse from Genesis where it says, get rid of the woman servant. Send her away. She doesn't belong in this house. And Paul quotes that verse in order to say, and so it is. The old covenant served its purpose. But folks, if you're still living by the law of Moses, it's time to get rid of the old covenant. Get rid of the woman, because now you need to be following the new covenant of Christ with grace and mercy and love of God. See, Hagar's popular. People love to take her story and then do something with it. But I need to come back to the story. And I want to give you my bottom line on the story of Hagar and Abraham and Sarah. Here's my bottom line. That was a bad idea. Whoever cooked that up ought to have their head examined, because that was a bad idea from the get-go. Now, first, if you just come at it with common sense, just use your head, just think it through, this was destined to be trouble. I mean, think about it, ladies in this room. A wife who says it's okay for her husband to have sex with this young lady, and I'll be okay with that, we'll live happily ever after. Oh, no. Because you know that's going to go south at some point, and it did, as those two women had issues thereafter. But you think about even from Hagar's perspective, this young woman who is being told what to do and used, well, she's a servant. Not much respect for who she really is. Also think about the attraction. She's going to have that child. She's going to carry that child for 9 months. That's not just something you just give away and doesn't matter. It does matter. And that will be her child. And this family is going to have tensions. The tensions are not going to be good. This was never a good idea. Common sense should have told you that. It reminds me of the same scenario when you get to polygamy. Remember how in the Old Testament days, some of those patriarchs, the man would be married to more than one woman, and we read those stories and say, well, I guess that must be okay, because after all, the Bible characters did it. Listen, just because a Bible character does something doesn't mean it's right. Sometimes we get stories to show wrong. And if you read every one of those polygamy stories, here's what you'll find. They always go badly. They don't go well, they go badly. You take, for example, the grandson Jacob. He'll marry sisters. Rachel and Leah, you're thinking, boy, that ought to work. Two girls who grew up together, love each other, and then married to this man, that's going to work out great. Worked terrible. Terrible. The two sisters fussed and fought with each other, provoked each other, and they fought over the love of this man, and he was favored one and not the other, and that's never good. And one could have kids, the other couldn't, and so she taunted the one that couldn't. This situation just went from bad to worse. 1 Samuel chapter 1, man by the name of Elkanah. He's got a wife, Peninnah. He's got a wife, Hannah. And the text says, and he loved Hannah. He was married to Peninnah. You get to where that situation is going. 2 wives and one is favored. One could have kids, but Hannah could not. And so her rival taunted her, and this was just a bad situation. Read every one of the stories. You'll see at some point common sense would say, I don't think that was a smart idea. 2 women trying to have peace with this one man as a husband. Same was true then for that surrogate motherhood. This idea was just destined to go bad, and it did. It didn't work out. But there's another reason, not just common sense, but God's plan. I mean, from the very beginning, when God called Abraham, time and time again, he told God what the plan would be. He said, you're going to one day have a son. You and Sarah will have a son. In fact, one day he said, His name will be Isaac. I mean, little by little, God kept laying out the plan. You and Sarah, a son named Isaac, and that will be the son from which your family and your nation will come. Now, that's what God had said. They should have just stuck with the plan, but they didn't. And if you're wondering why not, why did they digress from God's plan? Because they got impatient, because He made them wait. See, when God is giving us promises, He'll make them wait 25 years before He ever finishes the promise. And Abraham is 75 when he's hearing God talk to him, and they're already old. And every year they're getting older and older and older. And as it stretches out over those 25 years, they get impatient, thinking maybe we need to do something to make this happen. Abraham was the first one to break. Abraham decided to pick one of his servants, the one he trusted the most, and adopt him as his son. And now we've got what God wanted. God said, he's a nice guy, but that's not what I said. I said, you and Sarah will have a son. We'll call him Isaac. Sarah got impatient, and thus she brought Hagar and came up with this scheme. And Ishmael was born, and He will bless Ishmael. But He said, but that's not the plan. The plan is you and Sarah and a son named Isaac. See, what God was doing was testing them. He tested their patience, tested their faithfulness to see if they would stay on course, and they tended to diverge from course because they got impatient. And that's why they messed things up when they did. I'm looking at this plan. Hagar, she's somewhat of an innocent in this deal. She's just doing what she's told to do. But I'm still looking at a plan that common sense would have said no. God's plan said no, and yet they did, and it produced something troublesome. Which brings me then to a conclusion I got to give all of us in this room. I think we can all agree to this statement, and that is this. There are times when you and I just simply get it wrong. Isn't that the truth? Sometimes we're in a situation, and as I look at this situation, I have to be honest with myself and say, I did something wrong. I've gotten myself into a mess. That's the way life works sometimes. And not because I wanted to do wrong and I meant it to be bad. No, you had your good intentions, but sometimes you find yourself in the wrong place, wrong time. And now what do? Have you ever done that? Have you ever, for example, gone somewhere, and once you get there and you're in it, you're saying, I wish I'd stayed home. I wish I hadn't come. I don't belong here. You ever committed something? I'll do that. And then when the time comes to do it, you're dreading it. When you get into it, you're saying, I shouldn't have done this. I wish I hadn't committed. Ever said something, you wish you could take it back, and now you're haunted by what you said and the impact of what you said, and I wish I hadn't done it. You see, there are times in life you and I find ourselves in situations like Hagar. And here I am, and I'm stuck in a bad situation. Now what? There's no great solutions, no easy answers, but I will tell you this. One of the first things you need to do is admit it. Just need to own up to it and just admit it. I look at Sarah, for example. Sarah had a hard time with that because what Sarah did, she started passing the blame to everybody. She said to Abraham, you and this woman have caused me trouble. That was her idea to put those two together. And the Lord put me in this situation by not letting me have kids. She's blaming everybody, but you know what? You can try passing the blame around all you want. But if you're ever going to deal with life, sometimes you just got to go ahead and own it and just say, all right, this is the mess I'm in. And it may be you're not totally responsible. Maybe you're not very much responsible, but it's your problem just the same. So at some point you just claim the problem. This is my situation. I've got to deal with it no matter how I got here. So what am I going to do? So you go ahead and you grab it. And then once you do that, you deal with it. You try to make it the best you can. And there are times in our bad situations we can actually make it right once again. But you know, a lot of times in life, you're never going to make it right. There are some situations of life, it's bad and it never gets like it was. It can't be turned back. So you got to take this and figure out how to make this work the best that I can. Sometimes you're learning just how to tolerate a situation because I can't change what's been done. But no matter what, you're never going to come to peace with it until you learn how to deal with it and make something happen. And then when you do that, get right back on track. That is to say, whatever mistakes I may have made before, I don't want to repeat those. That's foolish. No, I've learned my lessons. I won't do that again. And I'm going to think more clearly before I do the next things I do, trying not to get myself in another bad situation. Folks, that's how you deal with life. That's how you and I are supposed to deal with life every day. When bad things happen, take ownership of it, deal with it the best you can, learn from it so you can keep moving forward, and in all of it, do like the angel told Hagar. Angel told Hagar she's setting out in the wilderness in this bad situation. The angel said, you need to put your trust in God. Because if you trust in God, God will take care of you and take care of the child. Because God is always faithful to those who are faithful to him. I will tell you, God kept his word. And as bad as that situation was for Hagar and Ishmael, it turned out okay. Fact is, the whole situation finally turned out pretty good, all things considered. Abraham and Sarah, they have their child Isaac, and the family will continue to grow. Hagar and Ishmael out in the wilderness, but eventually they'll settle in with some others. Ishmael will grow up, and I'll tell you his story next week because God blessed him richly. Because God does indeed take bad situations and turn them out for good for those who trust in him. Because God's always faithful to those who are faithful to him. And folks, that's really the lesson I want you to learn from Hagar, the handmaid who had to go. Let's pray.